So you want to get into playing PS2 in whatever year this is, well, it's still a great option and arguably has one of the best game libraries of all time. But because TVs and graphics have advanced quite a bit in the last 20 years, you do have some decisions to make when it comes to setting up your PS2. One quick note here, I'm talking about the physical games, the physical PS2 here. We're not talking about emulation. We're not talking about any of that PC stuff, okay? Your first decision is going to be what console to get. You have two options here. You got the OG PS2 Fat, and you have the sleek PS2 Slim. Now, I personally own multiple releases of both of these models, and I can tell you right now, any PS2 you pick up that works is probably going to be just fine, but there are some differences that you should be aware of between the two. The PS2 Fat is much larger and has a mechanical DVD drive. It can be positioned both on its side and upright, and fun fact, you can even rotate the PS2 logo to suit your orientation, which is something I didn't know until I was 30 years old. The PS2 Fat also comes with two big differences between the Slim, and that's going to be the hard drive expansion bay and the iLink port, which are necessary for a very small number of games if you're into the Time Crisis series, Time Crisis 2 and 3. Another difference is the spacing between the memory card and controller slots. This is something to keep in mind if you're going to be using a multi-tap for 4-player games, as you will need to get the right model, and the PS2 Fat multi-taps are usually easier to find. The PS2 Slim is obviously much smaller and, dare I say, more attractive. They even made it in a silver version, and just like the Fat, it can be placed upright, but you're going to want to put it on a stand because it's easy to knock over. The disc tray is fixed in place, and the fans are known to be much quieter on these models. Now, some people go back and forth on which is the better model, the PS2 Fat or the PS2 Slim. Personally, I could go either way. I've had multiple iterations of both, and I can tell you that all 4 of my PS2s that I've owned have died on me. Currently, I'm rocking the PS2 Fat model, but just about any PS2 you find that still works is going to be great. Just keep in mind, this is a 20-year-old console, so it's not going to last forever. I highly recommend finding an independent game shop that you can go test out a PS2 and that can repair it for you if it does break. Now, the second big decision, maybe the biggest decision, is the choice of TV. And this is where we can really go down the rabbit hole. If you're like me and you want the best quality and the most hassle-free gameplay experience, you're gonna have to get a TV with component input. And that's because the PS2 has analog video output and does not come with an HDMI cord. Now, the PS2 comes standard with composite cables with video output through the yellow channel and audio through the white and red, but this means that the maximum resolution is going to be somewhere around 240p, which is what most of us remember from our childhood. However, many games are capable of displaying a much higher resolution at 480p. If you upgrade to component cables, which have video output through the red, green, and blue channels. But they don't make TVs with component anymore. It was really only found in late stage CRT TVs or early stage flat screen TVs. Now, I personally own both a CRT TV and a flat screen plasma TV with component input, and I'll show you the difference in picture quality here from component to composite cables. You can see there's a pretty clear difference. For most people, I wouldn't recommend picking up a CRT TV unless you're seriously getting into retro gaming, in which case you're awesome. But there are a couple clear advantages CRTs have when it comes to the PS2. Number one is that lower resolution games are going to look better on a CRT TV, and the input lag is going to be virtually non-existent. And number two, light gun games like the Time Crisis series, one of my favorites for the PS2, can only be played on certain CRT TVs. Just make sure it has a curved screen like this one and isn't one of the later stage flat screen CRT models. And if you're really nerdy like me and want to play component on a flat screen HD TV, I actually recommend picking up a plasma TV. Now, they don't make these anymore, but plasma TVs had a much better contrast ratio and refresh rate than their LCD counterparts, and most can be found with component input. I've had this one for 15 years. It's still going strong. It still looks great, especially on the PS2. Now, if getting a new old TV is out of the question and you have to go HDMI, you can go the cheap route or you can go the expensive route. The cheap route is to get an HDMI conversion cable. These can usually be had for under 30 bucks, but I've heard a lot of mixed reviews on these when it comes to picture quality. I don't have one that I'd personally recommend, but it's definitely somewhere to start if you just want to get into playing PS2. The expensive route is to get an HDMI upscaler for the PS2, like the RetroTink 5X Pro, which converts an upscales component analog signal into digital HD video. I've heard a lot of great things about these devices, but they do run in the hundreds of dollars, so this is a question you're really going to ask yourself, is this really worth it to get into retro games? Or you could save a CRT TV from the landfill like I did and not have to fiddle around with any of these connections. And finally, the final decision to make is the controller. For me, this one's pretty easy. Just use the standard DualShock 2 PlayStation controller. Yes, it's wired, but it works great. I don't know how many times I've been at a sleepover and seen one of these controllers chucked across the room, but I've never actually seen one of them break. But if you do want to go wireless, just keep in mind that Sony never officially released a wireless PS2 controller. There are a few wireless options out there though. I've heard good things about the Logitech and Katana models specifically, but you may have to hunt those down. So that about wraps it for the best ways to play PS2 in the modern age of gaming. I've included links in the description below to my preferred PS2 setup if you're interested in checking out anything for yourself. So thanks for watching, and oh, don't forget to pick up one of these. You will need a memory card for the PS2 if you want to save your games.